Sir, can I follow you home? The 8-year-old's words froze every Hell's Angels member in that bar, bruised, starving, clutching a faded photograph. Her dark skin was etched with shadows of neglect, her tight curls tangled and unwashed. She wasn't lost. She was running from the man who'd been slowly destroying her since her mother died. The same man now plotting to make her disappear permanently for an inheritance he'd never earned. But this little girl remembered something her mother told her before she passed. If you're ever in danger, find that symbol. And she'd been watching that symbol across the street for 3 years, waiting for the right moment. What the Angels discovered in the next 48 hours would put a predator behind bars and change this child's life forever. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The door shouldn't have opened. It was Friday night at the Hell's Angels bar in the dusty outskirts of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Members only, locked tight, music loud enough to rattle windows across the street. The kind of place where strangers didn't wander in by accident, where the heavy steel door stayed bolted from the inside, where even cops thought twice before knocking. But the door opened anyway. And there, framed in the doorway with streetlight bleeding in behind her, stood an 8-year-old black girl who looked like she'd been through war. Tank saw her first. 6'4", built like his nickname suggested, covered in ink that told stories of violence and loyalty in equal measure. Dragons coiling up his arms, names of fallen brothers across his chest, a lifetime of choices etched into his skin. He was mid-laugh, telling some story about a ride through the desert when his eyes caught movement where movement shouldn't be. The laugh died in his throat. Every conversation in that bar died with it. Leather creaked as men turned. Pool cues stopped mid-strike. Beer bottles paused halfway to lips. This wasn't right. This was impossible. Kids didn't walk into this place. Kids didn't even look at this place. But there she was, tiny, maybe 70 lb, soaking wet. Her tight curls matted like no one had touched them in weeks. Clothes that hung loose on her frame, faded and stained. The kind of hand-me-downs that spoke of neglect more than poverty. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones too sharp, eyes too large for her skull, her rich brown skin dulled by exhaustion. The look of a child who hadn't eaten enough, hadn't slept enough, hadn't been safe enough for far too long. And the bruises. Even in the dim bar light, you could see them. Dark purple marks on her forearms. A yellowing shadow along her jaw. The kind of injuries that made grown men's stomachs turn. She didn't cry. That's what struck Tank hardest. She didn't apologize for interrupting. Didn't shrink back from their stares. Didn't do any of the things a terrified child should do when confronted with a room full of the most intimidating men in the county. She just stood there, small hands clutching something against her chest. Something they couldn't quite see yet. Her eyes scanning the room with purpose. She was looking for something specific, and when her gaze landed on the vests, on that distinctive patch every man in the room wore, something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly, recognition, maybe confirmation. The silence stretched like taffy, thick and uncomfortable. These men had seen things, done things, survived things that would break ordinary people. They'd spent decades building walls between themselves and the soft parts of humanity. The vulnerable parts because vulnerability got you killed in their world. But standing there watching this tiny, broken bird of a child, something ancient stirred in their chests, something protective and primal that transcended club rules and street codes. Then she spoke. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade, steady, clear, impossible for someone her size in a situation this insane. Just 2 words at first, directed at Tank, the biggest, scariest-looking man in the room. "Sir," she said, That one word carrying more weight than it should. "Can I follow you home?" The silence that followed was suffocating. You could hear the neon beer sign buzzing on the wall, could hear someone's boot scraping against concrete floor, could hear the music still playing, but muted now, irrelevant background noise to something far more important unfolding. These men, hardened by decades of loyalty, brotherhood, and choices most people couldn't comprehend, were not used to being addressed by children. Especially not children who looked like they'd been beaten. Especially not children asking for help in the one place society said they should fear most. Tank's brain was working overtime, trying to process what he was seeing, what he was hearing. How did she get in? Why was she here? Who was she? And more importantly, who had hurt her? Because someone had, that much was obvious. The bruises didn't lie. The hollow cheeks didn't lie. The way she held herself like she expected a blow at any moment. That didn't lie either. He moved first because someone had to. Tank crouched down slow and deliberate. The way you approach a frightened animal, non-threatening, careful, giving her space to run if she needed it. His knees protested the movement. Old motorcycle accidents making themselves known, but he ignored the pain. At her eye level now, he could see more details. Could see the dirt under her fingernails. Could see the way her pupils dilated slightly. Fear and determination warring in those young eyes. Could see she was trembling, barely perceptible. The adrenaline of whatever decision had brought her here starting to wear off. His voice, usually a weapon of intimidation that could make grown men reconsider their life choices, went soft. Protective. The tone you'd use with your own daughter if you were lucky enough to have one. "Why would you want to follow us, kid?" he asked gently. Though every instinct screamed that he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Wouldn't be simple. Would probably break something inside him that he'd spent years keeping carefully locked away. Before we go further, if you believe children deserve protection from predators, hit that subscribe button. This story gets darker. But I promise you justice is coming. Comment "Protect the innocent" if you're standing with this little girl. She didn't answer Tank's question with words. Instead, she held up the photograph. Her small fingers gripped it so tightly her knuckles had gone white, like she was afraid someone might rip it away from her. Like this single piece of paper was the only proof she had that her mother had ever existed at all. The photograph was creased, folded and unfolded so many times the paper had gone soft at the edges, threatening to tear along the lines, faded, too. The colors washed out from years of handling and probably tears, though you couldn't see those anymore. But the image was unmistakable. A woman stared back at them from that worn photograph, smiling, strong, eyes full of life and fire. She wore an old Hell's Angels vest over a band t-shirt, her dark hair pulled back, one arm slung around someone's shoulder just outside the frame. The vest was authentic. The patch was real, and every man in that bar recognized her instantly. Angel stepped closer. He was one of the founding members, gray threading through his beard now, age lines carved deep around his eyes. Scars mapped a violent youth across his knuckles and forearms. Bar fights, knife fights, fights he'd won, and fights he'd barely survived. He'd seen brothers die, he'd buried friends. He thought nothing could shake him anymore. But his hand trembled slightly as he reached toward that photograph, not touching it, just hovering there like he was afraid it might disappear if he made contact. His voice, when it came, sounded broken, crushed, like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed. "Lena's kid." The words barely made it past his throat. "But she died 3 years ago." The girl nodded. Just once. A simple confirmation that carried the weight of 1,000 lost days. "I was 5, she said, and her voice carried something no 8-year-old's voice should possess. Weight. Gravity. The kind of certainty that comes from trauma remembered too clearly. from nightmares that weren't dreams, but memories. I remember everything. She paused, and in that pause, you could feel every man in the bar holding his breath, waiting for whatever came next, knowing it would hurt. I remember her funeral, the flowers, the way people kept saying she was in a better place, like that was supposed to make me feel better. I remember the man who married her before she got sick, my stepfather. I remember him crying at the service. Another pause. Longer this time, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone flat, emotionless. The way people sound when they've said something so many times in their head that it's lost its power to hurt them anymore. I remember when he stopped pretending to be sad. The temperature in that bar dropped 20 degrees. You could feel it. The air went cold and sharp like broken glass. Tank's jaw clenched so hard his teeth should have cracked, his fists balled at his sides, every muscle in his massive frame going rigid with barely controlled rage. Around the room, other men shifted. Someone whispered something that sounded like a prayer or a curse. Someone else set down their beer with trembling hands because they understood now. Lena, their sister, their friend, the woman who'd earned her place in their world through loyalty and guts, who'd ridden with them through 3 states, who'd stood shoulder to shoulder with them when things got ugly, who'd proved over and over that family wasn't about blood, but about who showed up when it mattered. Lena had a daughter, and they'd never known. She'd never told them, never brought this little girl around, never asked for help. And now she was dead, and her child was standing in their bar looking like she'd been through hell. And they were just now finding out she existed at all. The questions crashed through Tank's mind like thunder. Why didn't Lena tell them? What happened to this child? Who was this stepfather? And what had he done? But he forced the questions down, forced himself to focus on the terrified little girl in front of him who'd somehow found the courage to walk into the scariest place she probably knew, asking the scariest people she could find for help. His voice stayed soft, gentle, even though every instinct screamed at him to find whoever hurt her and make them pay. "Why'd you come here, sweetheart?" he asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer would break him. Already knew whatever she said next would change everything, would demand action, would require the kind of justice the courts couldn't always deliver. She took a shaky breath, the kind adults take before confessing something they've carried too long, the kind that comes right before the dam breaks and everything spills out in a flood that can't be stopped. Her small shoulders rose and fell. And for the first time since she'd walked through that door, she looked like what she was. A terrified 8-year-old child who'd been holding on by her fingernails for far too long. "Because no one else will tell me the truth," she whispered. And then, even quieter, like she was afraid saying it out loud would make it too real. "And because I need help." And then the dam broke. The story came out in fragments. 8-year-old words trying to explain adult horrors, trying to make sense of things no child should have to understand. Her voice wavered at first, then steadied like she'd rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times, preparing for the day she'd finally have the courage to speak. The men listened in absolute silence, and with every sentence, the air in that bar grew heavier, darker, charged with the kind of rage that makes dangerous men even more dangerous. Her mother had left behind money, not lottery winnings or drug money or anything illicit. Honest savings, carefully protected, legally willed to her daughter. Lena had worked 2 jobs for years, pulling double shifts at the diner and weekend cleaning gigs, saving every penny she could squeeze from a life that didn't give much. She'd known her daughter would need it someday. She planned for a future she wouldn't live to see, building a safety net 1 crumpled dollar bill at a time. The account was substantial, enough to pay for college, to give this little girl options to honor all those hours Lena had sacrificed. Only 2 people had access to the full information, knew the account numbers and passwords and legal details. The girl herself, though she was too young to access it yet, and her stepfather, listed as temporary guardian until she came of age. At first, the girl said, her voice going flat now, detached. The way trauma victims learn to speak about their pain, like they're describing something that happened to someone else in a movie they watched once. At first, he acted kind. For the first few weeks after the funeral, he'd made her breakfast. He'd asked about school. He played the part of the grieving husband trying to do right by his stepdaughter. But after Mom died, everything changed. The kindness evaporated like morning fog burned off by a cruel sun. The mask slipped, and underneath was something cold and calculating and utterly devoid of love. The details came like punches, each one landing harder than the last. Starvation. Meals skipped as punishment, food locked away, her watching him eat while her stomach cramped with hunger. Locked rooms, her bedroom door fitted with a deadbolt on the outside, trapping her for hours, sometimes overnight, while he disappeared to do God knows what. Bruises explained away as clumsiness when the rare neighbor asked, when a teacher noticed, when anyone got close enough to see. And those neighbors, they'd been told she was slow, sickly, that it was better not to engage with her because she got confused easily, made up stories, needed special handling. She'd been kept silent, out of sight, a ghost in her own home, invisible to a world that should have noticed, should have cared, should have saved her. But here's what the stepfather didn't know. Here's what he never even suspected. This 8-year-old girl was far smarter than he imagined, far more observant, far more determined to survive. She'd been listening for months. She pressed her ear to doors when he thought she was locked away. She'd memorized phone conversations, storing every word in her mind like evidence in a case she was building against him. She decoded adult phrases, figured out what the euphemisms meant, what the silences between his words were hiding. She knew about the insurance payout, the life insurance policy he'd taken out on her 6 months ago, the one with him as sole beneficiary. She understood what the kid being more trouble than she's worth meant when he said it to whoever was on the other end of those late-night phone calls. She'd heard him tell someone about clearing the way, about handling things this weekend, about how accidents happen to children all the time, and nobody really questions it if you set it up right. Tank's fists clenched so hard his knuckles cracked like gunshots in the silence. The sound made several men flinch. His voice came out like gravel, like broken glass. He was planning to kill you. Not a question, a statement of fact, a recognition of evil that made even these hardened men feel sick. She nodded. And the simple gesture carried the weight of certain death avoided by the thinnest margin. I think he was waiting for the right time, she said quietly. An accident? Something believable? A fall down the stairs, maybe? Or something with the stove? Something that wouldn't make people ask too many questions. She looked up at these terrifying men with their ink and leather and scars. Men who should have frightened her. Men who the world had taught her to fear. But Mom told me something before she died. Right at the end when it was just me and her in the hospital room, she made me memorize. She made me promise I'd remember. Her small finger lifted, pointing at Tank's vest, at that distinctive patch every man in the room wore like a badge of honor. She said, "If I ever got lost, if I ever couldn't find safe people, if I ever needed help and didn't know where to turn, look for your symbol," she said. "It means loyalty, protection, family." The word family hung in the air like a prayer. She said, "The Hell's Angels take care of their own, and that I was one of your own, even if you didn't know it yet." The men around her, hardened by violence, cynical about humanity, trained to trust no one outside their tight circle, felt something they hadn't experienced in decades. Purpose, real purpose. The kind that comes when an innocent child looks at you and sees a hero instead of a monster. When someone who should fear you places their entire life in your hands instead. But there was still one question none of them had asked yet. One question that would change everything. If you can't stand predators who prey on children, comment in more silence. Every engagement tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Share this because what happens next proves that sometimes the people society fears are the ones who protect us most. Angel finally asked it. The question that should have been first, but somehow got lost in the shock and revelation and mounting horror of everything this little girl had already told them. His voice was rough, urgent now, because suddenly the abstract nightmare she described was becoming concrete, real, immediate. "Where do you live, kid?" She turned. Didn't say anything at first, just turned her small body toward the bar's front window. The one that looked out onto the street where their motorcycles sat, parked in a row like metal horses. She lifted one thin arm and pointed through the smudged glass, past the neon beer signs, across the cracked asphalt street at a small house with peeling paint and drawn curtains. A house they'd all seen 1,000 times without really seeing it at all. "There," she said simply. "With him. He doesn't know I left. He thinks I'm locked in my room." The men stared. Just stared. You could see the realization hitting them in waves, each one worse than the last. Some of them had been coming to this bar for 20 years. 20 years of Friday nights and Saturday afternoons. 20 years of parking their bikes in that same spot, walking through that same door, drinking their beer and shooting pool, and living their lives in this sanctuary they'd built together. 20 years of looking at that house across the street. Maybe noticing when the paint started peeling. Maybe seeing lights on or off. Maybe registering it existed the way you register background scenery you pass every day without thought. 20 years while a child was being tortured 50 feet away. 50 feet. You could throw a rock and hit that house from where they stood. You could walk there in 30 seconds and they'd had no idea, no clue, no sense that hell was happening within shouting distance of their clubhouse. Tank's voice went deadly quiet. The kind of quiet that's more terrifying than shouting. The kind that means violence is being considered and calculated and barely held in check. How long has this been happening? Each word came out precise, controlled, like he was afraid if he let any emotion leak through, he'd lose control entirely. 3 years, she said simply, like she was telling him the time or her favorite color since the funeral. 3 years. The number hung in the air like an accusation. 1,095 days of hell. 195 nights of being locked in her room. 195 mornings of waking up scared. And they'd been right there, right across the street. Close enough to help if only they'd known. Close enough to stop it if only someone had told them. Close enough that Lena's voice echoed in their heads now, asking why they hadn't protected her daughter, why they hadn't noticed, why they'd failed the one person she trusted them to save. But here's what none of them understood yet. The question that should have been obvious but wasn't. Why tonight? Why now? After 3 years of suffering in silence. 3 years of surviving hell alone. 3 years of walking past this bar every day knowing these men were inside. Why had she finally crossed that street tonight? What had changed? What had pushed her past fear and into action? The girl's face went even paler, if that was possible. Her hands started trembling again. The adrenaline that had carried her this far starting to fail. Reality crashing back in. "I heard him on the phone yesterday," she said, and her voice had gone small again, young again, scared in a way it hadn't been before. He was in the kitchen. "I was supposed to be asleep, but I couldn't sleep because I hadn't eaten in 2 days, and my stomach hurt. I snuck out to the top of the stairs to listen. He told someone he was handling it this weekend, that the timing was right, that he'd been patient long enough, and it was time to move forward with the plan. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking exactly like what she was. A terrified child who'd just run out of time. "That's why I came tonight, because I think he's going to do it soon. Maybe tomorrow, maybe Sunday, but soon. And I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know who else to trust. Mom said you'd help. Mom said you'd protect me. So I waited until he was drunk enough to pass out, and I picked the lock on my door. He doesn't know I learned how, and I ran." The bar exploded into action. It wasn't organized or planned or discussed. It was instinct, survival mode, protection mode. Every man in that room moved at once. Tank was on his phone calling someone who could help navigate this legally. Angel was pulling up the contact for their lawyer, the one who'd gotten them out of jams before and knew how to work the system. Crow was already at the window watching that house like a hawk, making sure nobody came out looking for her. Someone locked the bar door from the inside. Someone else was clearing a table, making space, and someone Tank couldn't see who put a jacket around the little girl's shoulders because she'd started shaking. The fear and exhaustion finally catching up to her now that she'd found safety, now that she'd done the impossible and asked for help from the only people her mother had trusted to give it. These men weren't lawyers. They weren't social workers or police officers or anyone with official authority to intervene in situations like this, but they'd spent decades learning how to document, how to protect, how to build cases that held up in court. Because when you live outside society's traditional structures, when you exist in the gray spaces between law and loyalty, you learn fast that protection isn't just about muscle and intimidation. You learn to protect your own with evidence, not just fists. You learn that the system won't take your word for anything, so you'd better have proof. Photographs, witnesses, paper trails that can't be argued away or dismissed. They learned these lessons the hard way, through brothers arrested on thin evidence, through charges that stuck because they hadn't documented their side of the story, through bitter experience that taught them the rules even when you didn't want to play by them. Angel pulled out his phone, his scarred fingers surprisingly steady as he opened the camera app. "We need pictures of those bruises, every single one." His voice had shifted into something methodical, professional, almost. Date stamped, well lit from multiple angles. "We need documentation that'll hold up if this goes to court." Tank grabbed a notebook from behind the bar, the kind they use to track inventory and tabs. Flipping to a clean page. "Write down everything," he told the girl gently. "Dates, times, what he said, what he did, everything you can remember. Don't worry about getting it perfect. Just get it down." Another member, Crow, lean and wiry with eyes that missed nothing, was already dialing, his phone pressed to his ear. Not 911, not yet. They needed someone they trusted in the system first. Someone who'd believe a Hells Angels member calling about child abuse. Someone who wouldn't dismiss this as a biker gang trying to stir up trouble or settle a score. The girl stood in the center of this organized chaos, watching these dangerous men transform into something else entirely. Something focused and protective and absolutely determined. She let Angel photograph the bruises on her arms, the ones on her legs, the fading yellow marks on her ribs where she lifted her shirt with the unself-conscious trust of a child who'd already decided these men were safe. She answered Tank's questions with startling clarity, reciting dates and incidents with the precision of someone who'd been keeping mental records long before this moment. Around them, other members were making calls, pulling up contacts, activating a network of people who owed them favors or shared their sense of justice, or simply understood that some lines you don't cross. And hurting kids is the brightest line there is. But then the girl did something that stopped them all cold. She reached into her backpack, a tiny thing worn and patched with cartoon characters faded almost beyond recognition, and pulled out a folder. It was one of those plastic expandable folders, the kind kids use for school projects, but this one was carefully maintained, organized with tabs and sections. She held it out to Tank with both hands like she was presenting something precious and fragile and vitally important. Tank took it, exchanged glances with Angel, and opened it carefully. What they found inside made every man in that bar go absolutely silent. Documents. Not just random papers, but carefully collected, organized evidence. Medical records from school nurse visits showing injuries dating back 3 years, each one with notes about how the injury occurred, each explanation slightly different, patterns that should have raised red flags, but somehow hadn't. Report cards with teacher comments about declining participation and possible home issues. Concern notes that had apparently gone nowhere. Photographs she'd taken with a disposable camera, the kind you can buy at a drugstore for a few dollars. Dated in careful handwriting, showing her bedroom door with its outside locks, showing empty cupboards, showing bruises on her own arms, held up next to a calendar to prove when they appeared. And at the bottom, sealed in a plastic page protector like it was the most valuable thing in the world. A letter. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, flowing, and strong despite the shakiness that comes with illness. Lena's handwriting. Angel recognized it immediately. He'd seen it on birthday cards, on notes left on windshields, on the backs of photographs from rides they'd taken together years ago. This letter was dated just weeks before her death, written when she must have known she was running out of time, and it named them. Named these men by name, by nickname, by reputation. Tank, Angel, Crow, half a dozen others. It explained who they were, what they meant to her, why she trusted them, and it explicitly stated that if anything happened to her, if her daughter was ever in danger, these were the only people she wanted protecting her child. Not family, not the stepfather. These men, the Hell's Angels. Angel's voice came out thick with emotion he wasn't used to showing. You've been collecting evidence. It wasn't quite a question, more like an expression of awe. For how long? 2 years, she replied simply. Like it was the most natural thing in the world for a 6-year-old to start building a legal case against her guardian. Since I was 6, Mom taught me to document everything before she died. She said, "If you want justice, you need proof." She said, "Nobody believes words alone, especially from kids, but they have to believe evidence." Lena had raised a warrior, a tiny 8-year-old warrior who'd spent 2 years preparing for this moment, collecting proof, building a case, surviving hell, while simultaneously documenting it for the day she'd finally have the courage to run. And that warrior had been preparing for this moment with the patience and strategic thinking of someone 3 times her age. If you believe this child is a hero, smash that like button. If you think predators should face justice, comment, "Lena raised a fighter." This little girl did in 2 years what many adults never accomplish. She built her own case. Crow's contact came through. Detective Elena Vasquez, a woman who'd worked with them before on a case involving witness intimidation, who knew the Angels weren't angels, but weren't liars either, who'd learned years ago that sometimes the people society dismissed as criminals had better intelligence networks and stronger moral codes than anyone gave them credit for. She listened to Crow's explanation without interruption, asked 3 pointed questions, and said she'd be there in 20 minutes. True to her word, 20 minutes later, 2 unmarked cars pulled up outside the bar. No sirens, no lights, nothing to draw attention from the house across the street. Not patrol officers who might spook the stepfather or follow rigid protocol without understanding the nuance of what they were walking into. These were detectives trained specifically in child abuse cases, people who'd seen the worst humanity had to offer, and learned how to build cases that actually stuck, that actually put predators away instead of letting them slip through legal loopholes. Detective Vasquez came through the door with her partner, an older man named Hale, who had kind eyes, and the weathered face of someone who'd spent too many years looking at things nobody should have to see. The tension in the bar was palpable. Hope mixed with fear, determination laced with the understanding that everything depended on the next few hours. Vasquez took one look at the little girl sitting at the bar wrapped in someone's leather jacket, took in the faces of the men surrounding her like a protective wall, and something in her expression softened. She'd been doing this job long enough to recognize when something was real versus when it was theater. They photographed the bruises with professional-grade equipment, multiple angles, proper lighting, date, and timestamps that would hold up in any courtroom. They documented her testimony on video, age-appropriate questions asked by a specialist Vasquez had called in, a woman trained in interviewing traumatized children who knew how to extract truth without leading, how to let the child speak in her own words without planting suggestions or creating false memories. The girl answered every question with that same unsettling clarity, that same weight in her voice that made everyone listening want to simultaneously hug her and find the person who'd done this to her. They examined the folder she'd assembled, passing documents between them with increasingly grim expressions, the meticulous organization and careful documentation impressive even to professionals who'd spent careers building cases. And they read Lena's letter. Read it twice. Actually, Vasquez's eyes moving over the words slowly, absorbing not just the content, but the desperation and love and calculated planning behind it. But then Vasquez set down the letter and looked at the assembled group with an expression that made Tank's stomach drop. "Everything she has is strong," Vasquez said carefully. "Damning even. The medical records show a pattern. The photographs are dated and detailed. The testimony is consistent and credible." Lena's letter establishes intent and planning. She paused, and in that pause, everyone heard the "but" coming before she said it. But without catching him in the act, without proof he was actively planning harm in the immediate future, without witnesses or recordings or something concrete beyond what amounts to hearsay and circumstantial evidence. The stepfather might walk, or worse, he might get supervised visits, might maintain legal guardianship with court-ordered anger management or parenting classes. The system doesn't like to completely sever parental rights without irrefutable proof of imminent danger. The words hit like physical blows. After everything this child had done, after 2 years of collecting evidence, after finally finding the courage to run, there was still a chance the system would send her back or partially back or keep him in her life in some capacity. While lawyers argued over semantics and timelines and the definition of imminent danger, that's when Tank made a decision that could have sent him back to prison. He'd done time before, 3 years in his 20s for assault, another 18 months for something he still wouldn't talk about. He knew what prison felt like, knew what it cost, and he made the calculation in about 5 seconds that this was worth it. "I'm going over there," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a decision already made. "No," Detective Vasquez warned, her professional mask slipping to show genuine concern. "You'll compromise everything. Any confession he makes, any evidence we gather, any statement he gives, it could all be thrown out if a defense lawyer argues coercion or intimidation. You know this, Tank." Tank's smile was cold, the kind of smile that had made smarter men than this stepfather reconsider their life choices. "I'm not going to touch him," he said quietly. "I'm just going to knock on his door like a concerned neighbor, going to ask if he's seen a little girl, and I'm going to see what he says when he realizes she's gone." He looked at Vasquez directly. Might be he says something stupid. Might be he incriminates himself without any coercion at all. Or might be he's smart enough to lawyer up immediately. Either way, you'll know what kind of man you're dealing with. The detective should have said no. Should have followed protocol, maintained the chain of evidence, kept civilians out of active investigations. She'd been trained for 20 years to do everything by the book, because that's how cases survive appeals and convictions stick. Instead, She looked at this massive biker with his ink and scars and dangerous reputation, looked at the little girl who trusted these men with her life, and thought about all the cases she'd worked where following every rule had let predators walk free on technicalities. Detective Hale was already pulling a body camera from his equipment bag. "Body camera," Vasquez said firmly. "Audio recording. And if he so much as breathes wrong, if he gives you any excuse to escalate, you back off immediately." Understood. Tank nodded once. 10 minutes later, after getting wired up, after receiving very specific instructions about what he could and couldn't say, after being reminded approximately 15 times that any physical contact would destroy everything they'd built, Tank stood on that porch across the street. The house looked harmless from the outside. Just another working-class home with peeling paint and a yard that needed mowing. He raised his fist and knocked on the door of a man who'd spent 3 years torturing a child. And when that door opened, when Tank saw the face of the person who'd made Lena's daughter into a ghost, everything fell into place. The stepfather opened the door wearing a smile. The kind fake people perfect over years of practice. The kind that doesn't reach the eyes, that sits on the face like a mask you can put on and take off depending on who's watching. "Can I help you?" His voice was friendly, neighborly, even the tone of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to gain from appearing cooperative. Then he saw Tank's vest, saw the patch, saw 6'4" of muscle and ink, and barely contained menace standing on his porch. And that smile cracked just slightly at the edges. A hairline fracture in the facade that told anyone paying attention this man was recalculating, reassessing, trying to figure out what this threat was and how to neutralize it. Tank kept his own expression neutral, almost bored, like he was asking directions or looking for a lost dog. "Looking for a little girl," he said calmly, each word measured and deliberate. "About 8 years old, answers to Lena's daughter, seen her around." He watched the stepfather's face carefully, the way you watch an opponent in a fight, looking for tells, for the micro-expressions that reveal what someone's really thinking beneath whatever words they're selling. The stepfather's face did something interesting. Not concern. That would have been the normal reaction. The human reaction when someone shows up asking about a missing child. Not confusion either. Not the bewilderment of someone who doesn't understand why a stranger would be asking about their kid. No. What flashed across his features was calculation. Pure, cold calculation. You could see his mind working. See him running through scenarios and responses. See him trying to figure out how much this biker knew and what the right play was. "She's sick," he said quickly. Too quickly. The words came out rushed. Defensive without the natural pause of someone who actually had to think about where their child was. "Sleeping. Can't be disturbed. She's had a rough week and needs her rest." He moved to close the door slightly, a subtle territorial gesture, establishing boundaries, asserting control over his domain. Tank didn't budge. He leaned against the doorframe instead, casual, relaxed. His massive frame effectively blocking the man's view of the street, blocking any sight of the unmarked cars parked 2 houses down, blocking everything except this conversation that was happening right now. "That's odd." His voice carried just a hint of skepticism, just enough to make the stepfather feel like he needed to explain more, to justify, to defend. "Because I got a call, she might be in trouble." "Concerned neighbor, you know how it is. People talk, people worry. Just wanted to check in, make sure everything's all right." And here's where predators always fail. They can't help themselves. They can't just say, "Thank you for checking," and close the door. They can't let perceived accusations stand unchallenged. They have to defend, have to explain, have to make you understand that they're the victim here, that they're the ones being unfairly judged. "She's fine," he snapped, irritation bleeding through the friendly neighbor act like ink through wet paper. "She's always making up stories. That kid, attention-seeking behavior, Classic signs. Her mother spoiled her rotten before she died. Let her get away with everything. And I've been trying to straighten her out, but it's been difficult. You try raising someone else's kid. See how easy it is. Tank let the words hang there for a moment. Let the stepfather hear his own defensiveness, his own unprompted explanations. So, you do discipline her? The question came out mild, curious, like Tank was genuinely interested in parenting techniques. The stepfather blinked. You could see the realization hit him that he'd said too much, revealed too much, walked into something he hadn't seen coming. I mean, normal stuff. Timeouts, sending her to her room. You know how kids are. He tried to recover, tried to make it sound routine and reasonable and completely normal. I don't actually, Tank said, his voice still conversational, but with an edge now, something sharp underneath the casual tone. Tell me how kids are when they need straightening out. The body camera mounted on Tank's chest caught everything. Every defensive statement, every unprompted explanation about bruises that Tank hadn't even mentioned yet. Every casual reference to discipline and difficult child and the need to be firm. The stepfather talked and talked, digging himself deeper with every word, explaining how kids lie, how they exaggerate, how sometimes you have to use tough love, how Lena had been too soft, and that's why the girl was so troubled now. And when Tank finally said, voice dropping to something cold and hard, "Funny thing, she's not in her room right now." The stepfather's face went white, not pale, white. The color draining so fast it was like watching someone have a medical emergency. Where is she? Not, is she safe? Not what happened? Not, did she run away? Just, where is she? Because his first thought, his immediate instinct, wasn't about her well-being or her safety or whether she was hurt or scared. It was about control, about knowing where his victim was, about maintaining his power over her. That's when the detective stepped into view. Detective Vasquez and Hale, badges out, recording equipment running, professional and calm, and absolutely done with this man's performance. And the stepfather realized all at once what had just happened. He'd confessed to child abuse on camera. He'd revealed his true nature to a Hells Angels member who now had every legal right to be standing exactly where he was, asking exactly the questions he'd asked. He'd done it in front of police who'd heard every word, documented every statement, witnessed every defensive explanation about discipline and difficult children and the need to straighten her out. The trap had closed and he'd walked into it willingly, unable to resist the urge to defend himself, to explain, to make these people understand that he was justified in everything he'd done. The arrest was clean. No drama, no resistance, no scene that would complicate the prosecution later. The stepfather went quietly, once he understood there was no talking his way out of this, no performance that would save him now. Detective Vasquez read him his rights in that flat, professional tone cops use when they've seen too much to get emotional anymore. And Hale secured him in the back of the unmarked car while the girl stayed safely across the street in the bar, surrounded by men who would have torn that house apart brick by brick if they'd thought it would help her. When they searched the house, they found everything the girl had described and worse. The locks on her bedroom door, industrial-grade deadbolts installed on the outside, the kind you use to secure storage units, not to keep a child safe, but to keep her contained. They found the empty kitchen, cupboards bare, except for his food hidden in high cabinets she couldn't reach, even with a chair. They found his bedroom, well stocked with groceries and snacks, and everything a person might need. While the child down the hall starved, they found her room tiny, sparse, a mattress on the floor with a thin blanket, no toys, no books, nothing that spoke of childhood or joy or the life an 8-year-old should have. And they found his computer. That's where the real evidence was. The kind that turns suspicion into certainty and transforms child abuse charges into something far more serious. His search history read like a manual for murder, accidental child death, life insurance payout timeline, guardian inheritance rights. How long does CPS investigate? Untraceable accidents, drowning statistics, children, searches going back months, careful planning, methodical research into how to kill a child and make it look like tragedy instead of homicide. But the prosecution's strongest evidence, the thing that made this case unshakable, wasn't the search history or the locks or even the medical records. It was the girl herself. At 8 years old, she testified with a clarity that made veteran detectives weep openly in the courtroom. She didn't cry, didn't break down. She sat in that witness chair, looking impossibly small, her feet not quite reaching the floor. And she told her story in chronological order with dates and details that defense attorneys couldn't shake on cross-examination. She showed her documentation, the folder she'd assembled presented as evidence. Each photograph and medical report and carefully dated note examined by the jury. She explained in her own words how she'd learned to hide evidence, tucking papers under her mattress, keeping the disposable camera taped behind her dresser, memorizing everything in case he found and destroyed her physical proof. She recited her mother's letter from memory, word for word, because Lena had made her repeat it back until she had it perfect, until she could recall it, even under stress, even years later. She explained how she'd waited 3 years for the right moment to escape, how she'd watched those men across the street, learning their patterns, waiting until she was absolutely certain they were her best chance at survival. The defense tried everything. They painted her as a troubled child with behavioral issues, someone predisposed to lying and attention-seeking. They suggested the Hells Angels had coached her testimony, planted memories, manipulated a vulnerable child to serve their own purposes. Though they were notably vague about what those purposes might be, they questioned the authenticity of Lena's letter, suggested it had been forged, demanded handwriting analysis and forensic examination. They tried to make the jury doubt, to introduce reasonable uncertainty, to create enough questions that a conviction became impossible. It almost worked, almost because reasonable doubt is a powerful thing, and defense attorneys know how to wield it like a weapon. But then the prosecution presented something unexpected, something even the girl hadn't known about. A safety deposit box registered in Lena's name, discovered during the investigation when they'd gone through her financial records looking for documentation of the inheritance the stepfather had been so desperate to access. The box had specific instructions attached. It could only be opened by her daughter once she turned 18, or by the Hells Angels members she'd named in her letter, if anything happened before then. Detective Vasquez had taken Tank and Angel to the bank 2 weeks into the investigation. And what they'd found inside changed everything. Updated medical records from Lena's final months, showing her suspicions about her husband documented in notes to her doctors. Concerns about how he looked at her daughter, about his sudden interest in her finances, about the life insurance policy he'd insisted they get. A second letter longer than the first, detailing why she'd married him despite her fears. The desperation of a dying woman who wanted her daughter to have a father figure, to have some semblance of a normal family, who'd convinced herself that maybe she was being paranoid, that maybe terminal illness was making her see threats that didn't exist. The guilt bleeding through every line as she explained her choice, her hope that she was wrong, her backup plan if she wasn't. In a full legal will, properly notarized and witnessed, naming the Hells Angels as emergency guardians if anything happened to her daughter. Not the stepfather, not family members. These men, she'd made it legal, made it official, made it impossible to dismiss as the ramblings of a dying woman or the manipulations of a biker gang Lena had known. Maybe not the specifics, maybe not the exact timeline of how her husband would try to destroy her daughter, but she'd known something was wrong. She'd felt it in her bones the way mothers do, that instinct that transcends logic and evidence. And she'd left breadcrumbs to protect her daughter even after death. She'd built a safety net across time, reaching from her hospital bed into a future she wouldn't live to see, making absolutely certain that her child would have protectors when she needed them most. "If you believe Lena is a hero even from beyond the grave," comment mothers always know, "if this story proves that chosen family is real family, hit subscribe because this ending, you need to hear it." The trial lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of testimony and evidence and legal arguments that filled courtroom transcripts with thousands of pages documenting evil in bureaucratic language. 3 weeks of the girl sitting in witness rooms with victim advocates, drawing pictures and doing homework while lawyers debated the admissibility of her evidence and the credibility of her testimony. 3 weeks of the stepfather sitting at the defense table trying to look sympathetic, trying to perform the role of wrongly accused father figure, his attorneys spinning narratives about troubled children and misunderstandings and circumstances taken out of context. But the verdict, when it finally came, took 30 minutes. The jury deliberated through lunch, came back before dinner, and the forewoman stood to deliver a decision that surprised absolutely no one who'd been paying attention. Guilty on all counts, child endangerment, abuse, attempted murder, because those search histories proved intent, proved planning, proved that this wasn't neglect or poor parenting or mistakes made under stress, but deliberate, calculated, premeditated harm. The judge was a woman named Olivia Grant, who'd been on the family court bench for 23 years and had seen every kind of case imaginable. She'd seen parents who genuinely loved their children but made catastrophic mistakes. She'd seen poverty masquerading as neglect. She'd seen mental illness and addiction and desperation that led good people to do terrible things. And she'd seen predators, real predators, the kind who wear human faces and speak human words, but have something fundamentally broken in the part of them that should feel empathy and love. She knew the difference, and when she delivered the sentence, her voice carried the weight of 2 decades spent trying to protect children from the adults who should have been protecting them. 25 years, no parole eligibility for 15. Immediate, permanent, irrevocable termination of any parental or guardian rights. The stepfather would be 68 years old before he could even be considered for release. Ancient by prison standards, his life essentially over. And when he got out, if he survived that long in a system where inmates have their own brutal justice for people who hurt children, he would have no legal connection to the girl whatsoever. No right to contact her, no claim on her inheritance, no ability to insert himself back into her life. He was erased legally and permanently, as thoroughly as the system could erase someone without capital punishment. But that wasn't the end of the story. That wasn't the resolution that mattered most. Because sitting in that courtroom, filling an entire row like a wall of leather and denim and defiance, were men in Hell's Angels vests. Men with ink and scars and reputations that made people cross the street, that made mothers pull their children closer, that made assumptions about violence and criminality before a single word was spoken. Tank sat in the middle, too large for the courtroom chairs, his frame overflowing into the space around him. Angel sat beside him, gray beard trimmed for court, hands folded in his lap like he was in church. Crow and a dozen others filled out the row, and they'd shown up every single day of that trial. Every morning for 3 weeks, they'd parked their motorcycles in the courthouse lot, getting special permission from security after the first day when their presence had caused concerns, and they'd filed into that courtroom to sit in silent support. They'd taken vacation days, rearranged work schedules, showed up in clothes that weren't their usual bar attire, making concessions to courtroom decorum while still wearing their colors, still making it absolutely clear who they were and why they were there. And that little girl sitting with her victim advocate had turned around every single day to look at them, to verify they were still there, to confirm she wasn't alone. The judge granted them guardianship, not temporary custody, while the system figured things out. Not foster care with visitation rights, full legal, permanent guardianship with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. Because Lena's letter, combined with their actions, combined with 3 weeks of watching these supposedly dangerous men show up day after day to support a child who wasn't blood, who they'd only known for a few weeks, proved something the system rarely acknowledges. Blood doesn't make family. DNA doesn't create obligation. Protection does. Love does. Showing up does. Being there when a child is scared and alone and needs someone to stand between them and the monsters. That makes family. And these men had proved it in ways that transcended legal definitions and social expectations. The inheritance was officially released. $247,000. Every penny Lena had saved grown now with interest and insurance payouts. A substantial sum that represented years of double shifts and sacrificed comforts, and a mother's desperate hope that her daughter would have options she never did. But the angels did something unexpected with it. They didn't touch it, didn't use it to pay for her care or offset the costs of raising a child or reward themselves for stepping up. They set up a trust working with lawyers and financial advisors, ensuring every penny would be protected until she turned 18. Managed by professionals, growing through careful investments, monitored by oversight committees, made absolutely bulletproof against anyone who might try to access it improperly. And in the meantime, she'd never want for anything. The angels would handle her expenses, school supplies and clothes and doctor visits, and everything a child needs. The inheritance would sit there untouched, growing, waiting for the day she'd need it for college, or a house or whatever future she chose to build. She grew up in the rumbling thunder of motorcycles, the sound that had once frightened her. That deep bass roar of engines, that aggressive mechanical snarl became the sound of safety, of family coming home, of protection circling around her. She lived in Tank's house at first in a room they'd converted from an office, painted pink, because she'd shyly admitted she liked pink when they asked what color she wanted. She ate dinner at a table surrounded by men with scarred knuckles and prison tattoos who cut her food and helped with her homework and checked under her bed for monsters with complete seriousness. Because if she was scared, then it was their job to make her feel safe. She learned to ride on the back of Tank's bike, tiny arms wrapped around his massive frame, helmet carefully fitted, going slow around the neighborhood until she learned to lean into turns. She grew up surrounded by men society feared, but her mother had trusted with her life. And Lena had been right. These men who the world saw as dangerous, as criminal, as outside the boundaries of decent society, they treated this little girl like she was made of glass and steel simultaneously, fragile enough to need protection, but strong enough to be respected. She had food, always, more food than she could eat. Actually, the kitchen constantly stocked because none of them could quite shake the image of her standing in that bar looking half-starved. She had safety, real safety, the kind that lets you sleep through the night without listening for footsteps in the hall. She had answers to questions about her mother, stories she'd never heard, photographs she'd never seen, a history that was hers by right. And she had a family, not the family genetics had given her, but the family her mother had chosen, the family that had chosen her back. And every night, Tank tucked her in with the same words. Every single night for years, the ritual never varying, the words becoming a promise, renewed daily. "You're one of us now," he'd say, sitting on the edge of her bed. This enormous man making himself smaller so he wouldn't loom over her in the darkness. Lena would be proud. And she believed it in a way she'd never believed anything the stepfather had told her. Believed it with the certainty of a child who'd learned the hard way how to tell truth from lies. For the first time since she was 5 years old, since the day they'd lowered her mother into the ground, and she'd gone home with a man who'd smiled at the funeral and stopped smiling the moment they were alone. She wasn't scared anymore. This is what real family looks like. This is what protection means. If this story moved you, share it because somewhere another child might need to know that help exists in unexpected places. Subscribe for more true stories that restore faith in humanity. Comment family isn't blood. If you believe chosen family is just as real, and if you've ever been that child who needed protection, if you've ever been scared and alone and desperate for someone to see you, to help you, to stand between you and the things that hurt you, I hope you found your angels.